Welcome to everyone joining for this this webinar. How do I buy a website? We'll be underway in a little bit. We're just letting people in from the waiting room, so we'll be underway in a couple of minutes with myself and Katie. Okay, it is just after 3 o'clock UK time. Thank you for those who are coming. We put the session back an hour. We'll get underway now with this TPC webinar. How do I buy a new website or how to buy a website? My name is Andrew Thomas. For those who don't know me, I'm the director of the Ticketing Professionals Conference, and I'm delighted to be joined by Katie Moffat for part two of this website series this autumn. For those of you, I know it's a very small number of you who've never used or been on a Zoom webinar. If you head down to the bottom, there's a Q&A box down there where you can put your questions in for Katie. This is a bit of a hot topic, but an important one. We're discussing procurement and website as a service versus the traditional model. But I will hand over to Katie Moffat to kick us off. Katie.
Thank- Thanks, Andrew. And also, just an apology for we changed the time of this session. So I think there's probably a whole bunch of people who are going to be waiting for the recording. So into the future, to apologize for those people that you couldn't join live. And hello. Yes, so this is part two of a series, as Andrew was saying, about procuring websites. It's 2025. We all know about kind of websites, how important they are, all that kind of stuff. But we wanted to really kind of go back to the beginning, really, and think about how you best kind of go through this process. So I've been involved in literally hundreds, definitely tens of procurement processes around websites. And I've looked at many, many, many different RFPs, requests for brief proposals. And so I think from all of that, there are just some key learnings really that we wanted to share. And as I say, this is being recorded and is going to be shared afterwards as a resource. So last session, we looked at how to evaluate your site, whether it's better to fix it or improve what you've got or to completely replace it, and how you might make a business case for budget. And so this week, following on from that, we're going to talk about how to run an effective procurement process. And by effective, that means so that you're not, if you're on the client side, you're not running around like a headless chicken. You feel like you know what you're doing. You're going to select the right agency, partner, and that you end up with the right solution. So we're going to go through the procurement process, navigating proposals and pitches, common pitfalls of that, custom solutions versus website as a service. I know there are some kind of there's lots of strong views either side on that. And then how to make your site future proof, maybe. I don't know if that's even possible, but we will get into that. So first off, what does a good procurement process look like? I've included this because actually, although it seems very common sense, a lot of, again, in my experience, sometimes people procuring websites don't take this approach and it kind of all goes a bit wrong. Essentially, you want to be thinking about what you need the outcome to be, what you need from your website. You want that to be evidence-based. So we talked last week about gathering evidence, data, other qualitative insights to inform your brief. You want to have to have a structure to that procurement process, but I would say you want to keep flexible as well, because you might get a curveball thrown at you either from a supplier or internally. Of course, you need to think about what you're trying to achieve in terms of your organizational priorities. And I guess a plea really from the sort of vendor side of things for transparency around how you're going to choose your supplier. Now that it's entirely up to you, you can do it however you want. It's your decision. I would say the clearer you can be on how you're making your decision, the better it will be for you as well, because agencies will know what it is that you're looking for, and how you're going to make that decision. I will talk about what makes a good brief and therefore ergo what makes a bad brief. But before we do that, before we get into that, we thought we'd do a little quiz, which is for the clients among you, which I know that we're a lot signed up. Maybe not so many who've actually been able to attend live, but hopefully we'll see the recording, which is what procurement personality are you? So again, I've dealt with many, many, many people who were, wanting to buy a new website, and they do tend to fall into one of a few different types. This is not a criticism, it's just an observation. So the first one is the overthinker. I'd say this is someone who sends a brief that's about 30 pages long. Um, we all collectively work in arts and culture, heritage, visitor attractions, a bit wider, museums, but we're not procuring NHS websites or even, incredibly complex. And by complex, I'm talking about, kind of £2 million project websites. And so my personal opinion, I don't think you need a brief that's that long with absolutely every single minute detail. Um, Second one is, and unfortunately, I have come across a few of these, and this is really where this tends to be not the client as a whole, but individuals within a team who are, for want of a better description, they do have their heads turned by a flashy homepage mock-up. So it's like, yeah, but they put animation in a kind of pretend design that they did. Like again, all of this is tongue in cheek, of course it is, but genuinely, it's not a good idea to be focus a lot of attention on what I would call, kind of quite shallow stuff at this stage. Occasionally you come across this, I would say, is a rare personality type, but does exist. So this is a client who's very much like, I actually don't really care that much about websites, and I just want you to get on and do it. And I don't even really want to have that many conversations about it. Some agencies perhaps would quite like that approach, some people, but what the risk, of course, with the outsourcer is that they will eventually pop up at some point, either right at the end of the procurement process, or even once the site's being started to be built, and they'll say, "Oh no, I didn't mean like that. I wanted it like this." So that's why this is not a good approach. Um, this is quite a niche reference unless you're into Captain America, but essentially this is the expert. So lots of people who are involved in the procurement of websites are absolutely 100% digital experts, and they have all sorts of understanding and specialisms in terms of working with different APIs, integrations, etc., etc. But we also, this is the kind of royal we, sometimes come across people who they sort of aren't experts, but they feel like they have to pretend that they are. So it's kind of that can lead to either somebody being impressed by something that is a bit of a red herring, or them just kind of going off on a tangent about something that's actually not critically important to the website. And finally, this is probably my favorite type of procurement kind of client person. So this is when you have it's usually one person in a group in it. So let's say you have a group of kind of 4 or 5 people who are involved in perhaps a pitch process on the client side, and everyone's kind of getting very excited about all sorts of things. And one person is very much grounded in the reality of, we need to do this huge content migration, and I know it's really boring, but can I just because I think, that stuff, it's building a new website is super, it is exciting. Often it's taken people a long time to get a sign off for budget, things like that. It's really exciting. And so it's easy, therefore, unfortunately, for people to sometimes get carried away with all the shiny things. And so, I think there's a balance between getting too into the weeds of stuff in a procurement process, but also not getting too carried away with stuff that is arguably not that critical. So thinking about, again, I think some people might think, well, how hard is it to get a website? You just talk to an agency and say, build us a website. Well, yes, but depends on all sorts of things, such as the complexity of the site that you're building, etc., etc. They're not all smooth sailing, I will say, the procurement processes. And so, yeah, that's why getting these foundations right is super important. And the first one is definitely the brief, which is absolutely critical to all of this. And I'm sure other agency representatives who are on this call will have come across clients who don't write briefs and don't, and that's their prerogative. And sometimes it's fine just to have a chat. But personally, I think a brief is super useful, not least because there's usually more than one person involved ultimately. And if you don't have a clear brief that other people within the organization have had some input into, then it can be easy to go off on all sorts of different tangents post, appointment. So in terms of writing a strong brief, there's I think 8 points altogether that I've got on this slide and the next one. Of course, you need the stuff like who you are, who you're trying to reach, overall strategic direction. So are you going to be doing lots more, particularly if that strategic direction is something that's not apparent on your existing site? So if you're going to be moving into doing paywalled digital content or educational content that needs to be, again, behind a paywall, that kind of thing. Like, what is the strategic direction of the organization, and if relevant, what are the problems with your current site? Fortunately, this is a really usual thing to include in a brief. It's important. Things like, our CRM isn't properly integrated. The booking path is terrible. All of those versions of things our overall engagement in content's really low, whatever. What are the outcomes? And connected to that is, I guess, what the outcomes are that you would hope for the new site. You don't need to get into like absolute specifics, but just generally is useful. And of course, what are your functional needs, by which I mean integrations, CRM integrations, but not exclusively. Obviously, there's lots of other integrations. What key booking journeys do you have? So it might be memberships, ticket booking, experiences, etc. What forms might you need? All that sort of stuff, the functional stuff. I should say as well that in terms of that third bullet, outcomes you expect and the kind of content workflows, if you're a bigger organization, it is really useful to include in that brief who works on the site, and how does content get published, and how do you manage things like sign-offs and all of that kind of stuff. And therefore, what sorts of, like our learning team writes course descriptions and our marketing team has to sign those off and publish them and whatever. That kind of thing, essentially. One point on the functional as well, which is interesting, I think, is ideally, I would say, you would have chosen your CRM or ticketing provider, assuming you are a ticketed organization, first before you go to a web agency. But of course, sometimes organizations haven't, and they will come with a brief that says, we need a new website, and we are also in the process of, selecting a new provider. That's fine, but I have been involved in processes, or had conversations with organizations where they've said, we we know that we need a new ticketing system, but we want to do the website first. And if you're absolutely sure that you're going to be changing providers in any piece of critical tech that integrates with the site, then choose that first before you rebuild a new site. Although there may be, when we get on to talking about custom versus website as a service, this point may be disputed. Next slide. What else needs to go on a brief? Of course, anything else around, I mean, the first point here, non-functional needs. So functional in this sense means, where you need it to actually do something. So non-functional is all the other stuff really, but which is super important. So performance, accessibility, security. With the latter two there, accessibility, most people will just say it needs to meet WCAG 2.2 standards. Security, you don't need to specify to what standard, but you want to be really clear on if there are that it needs to meet security standards. Some council-run venues obviously have stricter requirements. You need to be cyber essentials accredited, etc. Governance and internal workflows, slightly different to the content stuff I was talking about before, because that's more about how sort of operational realities impact the website. So how does event information travel from programming through to marketing, through to the CRM, through to the website, or how do digital teams work with the box office or learning teams? And again, these sorts of points that become much more relevant for bigger, more complex organizations than a smaller regional theatre. Scope clarity, what is included, what isn't, that's only really relevant if there's something that is that an agency would either assume is included and for some reason it's not going to be. I'm trying to think of a good example. I can't off the top of my head. And of course you need to say like what's the process and what are the timelines. I think unless you've got a very valid reason why, try to avoid specifying the solution prematurely. So what I mean by that is sometimes people will write a brief that says we want a headless CRM. Sorry, not CRM, CMS. This is the problem with these webinars. We want a headless CMS, but when you ask them why, they can't really answer that. It's just because it's something that they think they've heard and they think they need, and versions of that essentially. You're really thinking about outcomes and what you want your new website to be and do. There are lots of great agencies out there, loads. That is just a fact. And so I think in a way, if you're on the client side, this is the fun bit, but it's also quite hard, I think. The number of times that clients have said to me when I was, previously at a web agency about, oh, it was so hard to choose, it was so close, etc., etc. Hence this lovely graphic. One thing I would say before I just go through this about how to choose a good agency is, and this is a plea really from me, but for what that's worth, I personally think completely open tenders where you just publish it on LinkedIn are a very bad idea. But I am talking really within the context of arts and culture, museums, heritage, visitor attractions. And in the end, obviously, again, clients can do what they like. The reason I say that is because what tends to happen is you will be inundated with loads and loads and loads of proposals, and probably 70% of them will be from agencies that have never worked with that ticketing system. And they'll say to you, oh, it's fine because we work with APIs all the time. It doesn't matter. It does matter. So ideally, you want to do a bit of research before and perhaps invite 5 or 6 agencies, maybe 7, that kind of number, to send in a proposal, just because I think you get a better outcome that way. And on the agency side, speaking from that, I would say, it takes time to respond to these things, and time and resource. And so ideally, it's everyone's interest really for it to be a bit more considered. You've probably read these bullets now since I've been going there. So some things, what should you look for? An agency that understands the audience and the sector in which you work, definitely. Lots of agencies specialize in all sorts of areas, and that does give them a really good understanding of the challenges, common problems, common opportunities to improve things, etc. Um, an agent, I would say, again, I'm back on my high horse about visuals and shiny things. It's thankfully a practice that I think has died off now, but many years ago, like 10 years ago, maybe more, there was a kind of trend for what we want you to do as part of the proposal is come back with like 5 or 6 samples, sample screen pages for the site or a home page design. I would argue, and as would many others, that that's a complete waste of time. It's a waste of the agency's time. It's not, you can see their design skills by looking at their portfolio and the work that they've done in the past, essentially. Can they answer questions in plain language and not just answer in jargon? Really important, um, especially because if for nothing else, it kind of you'll get the vibe of them if they're not trying to kind of bamboozle you with all sorts of technical talk. Do they have experience with, back to the point about sort of ticketing systems, in particular in the arts and culture sector? It really matters to have experience in with those particular systems and APIs. Um, and yeah, again, the I think the last two are, well, the second to last one here, penultimate one, is more of a nice to have. It's kind of, do you feel that this is a process where they're kind of interested in talking to you and finding out more, and that you're, if you want to do that, and some clients don't. And then finally, yeah, like, are they clear on the sort of risks and constraints, any assumptions about sort of what you're expecting? Do you just feel that there is kind of transparency and honesty there is what I would say. What to look out for in pitches. Again, this is similar in a way to the brief thing, but really you're looking for that clear understanding of your users, who they are, what they want to do, what they need to do on the site. Um, does the agency, are they proposing a credible, proven technical architecture, infrastructure, actually, that should say, rather than architecture. Um, do you think that the timelines are realistic, and does the pricing seem kind of transparent? That's important, not least because this is a partnership that you're going to be going into for a long time, and hopefully. And so you want to feel that everyone's being upfront about costs right from the beginning. Um, a clear plan for risk management is more about during the project phase. So are they clear, what might sort of what the sorts of things that might derail a project? How would they deal with that? Um, you know, even things like, what if this incredibly important person on the project, what something happens to them, what's the fallback, etc. Yeah, we've talked about integrating with CRM. So the team continuity is a similar project. Obviously, you, it's not uncommon to get the CEO in the pitch, but then you never see them again. That's not a good sign. And how does the agency work? Now, that specifically on that point, that is really about and again, this will be different for custom versus website as a service, but some agencies have a very almost rigid structure to how they work. And actually, for all the talk of agile, they're not really. And you might need flexibility in how the site is built once you've appointed. So you may need, that could be for all sorts of reasons. You may need to start work, then pause for a couple of months. Maybe you run a festival and that's, festival period, and then you want to pick it up, whatever it is. Just be sure to feel that you that they understand any sort of, they understand and are able to accommodate any particular circumstances of your situation. Red flags. I'm sure that yeah, these won't be news to anybody. Over promising, we can do anything. Yeah, we can do that. Yeah, we can do that. It might be that they can do that, but if it's yes to everything with no clear sort of thought behind it, that's maybe a red flag. No mention of accessibility at all or user testing. Arrogance is not a good thing. The assumption that, well, we just know because we build these sorts of sites all the time, so we know what's good is a red flag. We'll figure out the CRM integration later. I guess again, this is more to do with custom builds, so low prices that don't match scope. So unfortunately, there are people in terms of arts and culture, there are agencies all the time trying to break into the sector. That's absolutely fine and understandable. It's a great sector to work in, but that can lead to massive undercutting. And I would argue that's not a good thing for anybody. I don't know, maybe other people have a different perspective on that. Technical jargon we've talked about. In terms of a pitch, obviously, if it's a generic, if it feels like a generic presentation, that's definitely a red flag. They're just kind of going through the motions. And again, back to that kind of question about it's a bit of a distraction technique to say, oh, yeah, but look at these wonderful designs that we've put together to show you, make you really excited about the project. Okie dokie. Current hot topic. Um, I feel like this is going to be an interesting one because I know that there's some very strong opinions out there, and I am not here, just to be clear, I do not sit here as the arbiter of like one is better than the other. Um, for for people who are thinking of procuring a website and they have never come across the term WaaS, it is basically means website as a service. It means that instead of building a custom site, you are essentially website as a service providers. Are it's more like it's more like a product basically that is adapted to your needs. And we will talk about pros and cons in a second. You will hear arguments for both sides. Today isn't about saying that one is better than the other, because I don't think it is, personally. I think, yeah, it's pros and cons. But the key thing I would say from the client side is just to really understand the differences, what you're getting, speak to those agencies. Everybody will explain the kind of the pros of their particular approach. So yeah, it's just really understanding what you need essentially. And I do think it's a good thing. This does feel like a very critical is the wrong word. This feels like a very a point in time when things are changing. So yeah, I think that we are in an interesting period. Andrew?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in here because I think when you said there it's an interesting period, and I'm from a ticketing background mainly and ticketing procurement. I feel that this is very similar to when we had this discussion in ticketing SaaS 2008 9. And I think it's when people are confused. I think they're suspicious or there's not enough WAS talk. And so when companies like Ticketsolve and Spectrix and others came along and used this term SaaS, they were dismissed because you on this hand you bought a CD with 15 licenses on from
Yeah,
traditional company, and here these people are with, oh, it's X pence per ticket. And it was a very hard time, and I mean, I've got some questions when we talk later
yeah,
about it, but I think it's really great for you to frame it that way, that we're at this point when not enough is it's not a common enough term, so
exactly.
it's a very
It's misunderstood.
it's a
Yeah, and I
very
think
interesting time, yeah.
I would say, but this is completely with no hard data to back it up, but maybe others do have data. I would say that and speaking for the arts and culture sector in the UK, so that's a very specific context there. I would say that um, many people still don't know what WaaS is, and perhaps, well, not perhaps, definitely the conversations that are happening now around website procurement are their first introduction to it. So it is a really interesting time. So I'm going to, with all that said, I'm going to head into battle, and I'm going to do pros and cons of both, and you can come at me um, now or afterwards if you're watching this as a recording. Um, so website as a service, pros. It's definitely a lower upfront cost. Absolutely, definitely. We can talk about, I will get into budget in more detail, but that's just a given. And therefore that's often appealing. Usually, definitely faster to launch. You know, absolutely. Um, so things like hosting and updates to the platform are included in a monthly license fee, whereas with custom, the site gets built and then you will have probably an SLA, service level agreement with an agency, and that will give you usually a certain number of hours. Within that hours, it'll include things like updates and stuff, but that means you're sort of using up that time. So it's like similar but different. Um, Arguably, again, a more predictable monthly spend. So you're not, if you're not sort of 1 month doing lots of things and it's really expensive, and then next month, um, it's not much, and it's more predictable. I should say as well, actually, because I maybe didn't make clear, but the point about for those who maybe are even new to digital products is you are essentially paying it more as a license fee model. And so things like updates to the system and all that kind of stuff are absolutely part of that monthly cost. There are some nuances in all of this, of course, as there always are, which again, we can come on to. Okay, cons. This is where the fighting starts. Arguably, less flexibility in design and layout. I mean, and I think well, it is true. Um, that's not to say that I mean, again, sometimes people will say, well, the level of flexibility that, so, no, I think how to put this right. So, website as a service providers would say that actually the level of flexibility that we can provide in design is absolutely really all that's needed, given that you're not like, for most organizations in the sector, that it is sort of, again, arts, culture, visitor attractions, that broader world. The sorts of things, the sorts of websites that you need it's not like some mad experimental interface. So actually we can handle that, but I would argue there is less flexibility in design generally. So with website as a service, in the same way as any kind of digital products, so like booking paths or whatever, you have a roadmap of features that are then rolled out to everybody on that platform. That roadmap is decided by the platform, albeit lots of providers do that in consultation with their customers, obviously, because they want to know like what's your priority. But what's your priority, etc. But if you're somebody you really want feature X and they don't have feature X and it's not a priority on that roadmap, then you'll have to wait for it essentially, rather than with a custom solution, it could be done for you, again, depending on budgets and so on. This is a controversial one. Integrations may be limited. Um, yeah, just may be limited. A lot of website as a service providers have absolutely locked in kind of API access as standard, and that's a pro because it makes it really easy to connect in the case of ticketing, Spectrix or Testatura or whatever. But if you are working with a system that is not already integrated into that platform, it could be tricky. And then the last point there about unique program structures. So what I wanted to say about this is, and I think Andrew and I were talking about this earlier, and um, the truth is that if you are a small regional theatre, really small, you have a very simple program where you sell tickets to events that you put on, and that's really it, then eh, all things being equal, and you have to think about budgets and stuff, website as a service is probably a good solution for you. If you are a complex, multi-strand, multi-layered, maybe multi-venue organization, say you run a festival and a year-round season and an online learning program and residencies and recurring workshops, and you also have online collections and etc., a website as a service is going to find it harder to support that type of complex um, information architecture and sort of multi-strand programs basically. And then there is some sort of things where around kind of learning and educational needs, and where you might need to provide content in a certain way to different types of audiences. Again, these are all, I'm sure, arguable both ways, but just out of the box, it is going to it's going to be harder to deal with those things. Custom build. So this is where a provider is building your CMS, not quite from scratch, because they will have their own a preferred CMS and also some kind of structure that underpins that. But essentially, they are building it for you. That's probably a more technical way to describe that, but that's the sort of nuts and bolts of it. So arguably, you have more design autonomy over this and kind of UX flexibility. So the actual user experience side of things, again, arguable. Um, it can be easier to tailor, content models and workflows to, well, less workflows actually, but more kind of content delivery. Again, if you've got quite specific needs that aren't just this, and this. Adaptable to whatever integration you have. That's a bold statement, isn't it? I mean, yes, although potentially an agency would still have to go away and figure out how to do that. But the point is that it's going to be easier to get that from a custom build, arguably. And maybe more easily adaptable to sudden or significant program or strategy changes that require you to do some to significantly change, add some like a whole other program of work onto your site, or something of that nature. A few other bits before we finish off. So the cons of custom build, definitely more expensive up front. Um, Actually, one thing I didn't say with WaaS is obviously the thing with custom is it costs you more up front, but then it's going to be um sorry, start again. The thing with custom build is it's going to be more expensive up front, but arguably over a longer time period, you're going to be not spending as much as website as a service. But again, this is all context specific. It will take longer for that site to get live. Absolutely, that's a given. There's the potential for you to have to do more post-launch maintenance because it's not. What I mean by that is to sort of pay for it and for that to be scheduled in by the agency. And ongoing support costs are less predictable over time than website as a service. So before we round off, I mean, let's talk a bit about budgets and timelines, which is the juicy bit. Everyone always wants to know how much does it cost to build a website. Uh, yeah, I mean, again, this is probably fairly obvious. The more complicated your site, the more expensive it's going to be, essentially, with all, lots of caveats to that. Okay, so again, we can get into it. The custom build and WaaS use different funding models. To give an approximate idea, and this is really for custom builds, I will say, which actually it doesn't specify there, but Uh, for UK-based arts and culture, charitable organisations builds are typically between 0.5% and 5% of overall annual revenue, with 15 to 20% of that build cost required for support and updates on an annual basis. So yeah, expensive. WaaS is much less for setup, but more over a longer time. So your monthly payments may be more, but critically, if from a CFO perspective, you will be paying more for a longer period of time. But then WaaS providers would argue, yeah, but you won't have to rebuild your site in like 7 years. So again, don't come at me. I'm just the webinar person. Timeline, very quickly, it massively varies. This is just a kind of top of the line thing. Custom build tend to do discovery, followed by design and build, content migration if you're doing it, and obviously not all clients do, and then testing QA and launch. So you're looking like 9 months, typically 9 months, 12 months, depending on the complexity of the site. WaaS a lot quicker. And again, I know that, it can be even quicker than that, arguably, but regardless of whatever option you choose, client responsiveness is like super important. So, like if you're messing around and don't reply to emails and miss deadlines, then don't expect the agency to deliver your website on time. So I was interested to hear from people because people will always, I mean, I was asked this many, many times when working at an agency, how do we like future-proof our website? Which is kind of interesting because again, it's like I'm not sure you can really. Like we don't know what's going to happen in 5 years. However, I think the key elements of it are a content model that makes it really easy to add and edit content without developers, structurable, reusable components, strong accessibility foundations, of course, scalability and integrations. So that kind of decoupled architecture where possible. So not having a booking path that's like completely integrated with your website so that if you ever need to decouple those two, it's not painful. Yes, and other things that we have talked about already. And I think in terms of like post-launch is like, do we have a plan for what we need to do and what it's going to be? And then are we going to look at it regularly? So I think that's it really, just a bunch of questions there. You don't need to, the penultimate point there about do you know which delivery model is the best fit for you? That doesn't need to be a critical decision before you begin a process. You may actually want to use the process to make that decision, and that is really common at the moment. That will possibly change over time as everybody becomes a bit more familiar with WaaS as a product. So I'm mindful of time, so I'll stop now, Andrew. Yeah.
Okay, I've got a stack of questions slash discussion points. We've already got some questions coming in. I'll come to those very shortly. So, have you got a question or a point to make? Please do pop it in the Q&A now for Katie, or if it's a point to carry on the discussion, we'd love to hear that. Um, I've got another persona for you. It's not a question. I'd love. I had it as a ticketing consultant and selling ticketing systems, the persona of, but we're so different to everyone else where you're not the same.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
That's a classic of the
yeah,
genre.
yeah. But anyway, I have a question for you about life cycle of a website, which is why
Mhm.
it's on that last point on pricing, which
Yeah.
is, and we talked about this, I think, on last week's webinar about the kind of putting oil in the car and checking the tires. And this will come on to a question we've already got waiting as well. But if I'm paying, let's say, £1,500 or £2,000 for to save my maths per month for a WaaS solution, it's costing me £24,000 per year. If I keep it for 10 years, it's going to be 110, £120,000 I was spent on that website. But at what point should we look at because obviously if I'd had a custom build some do last that long. How should we be evaluating
Yeah.
that? Because if it goes on forever, of course WaaS is going to be more expensive. But realistically, how often do we change websites? So therefore, should
I
we
know
look
what
at
you mean. Yeah.
should we look at
The
7 years
capital.
or 5 years? What way?
Yeah, I
What?
mean, there is also like from a financial perspective, but again, I think this will change, and this is a much more detailed conversation about how organizations allocate funding. And a website can often be, if you're using the custom model, it can often be allocated as capital spend, whereas ongoing, what would be considered license fees are not, you can't capitalize them. So there is a question there. I mean, that's more about kind of especially in the UK charity finance and but obviously there's ways
Mhm.
around all of that. I look, as I say, I think that we are at an interesting point in the market actually, because historically 5 to 7 years, I would say, would be typical for a website. A lot of sites, up and around 8 years, 9 years, still functioning well. But really, once you get past like 7 years, it usually starts to creak a bit. But that's usually because the underlying infrastructure has become a bit creaky and old. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think it's different. Perhaps the model that we've been using is going to change because we won't need to rebuild. I do think there are times though when people, for better or worse, they just want they want a completely fresh approach. They want a new vision. They want, so there are some things that are just a bit more intangible around why people perhaps prefer to think, yeah, actually, we want to start again rather than, which isn't really answering the question, Andrew, because I know it was more about that sort of budgetary thing. But I think, it's a bit like a new car in the sense of sometimes people just want like a completely new model, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, there is a capital cost thing, which is interesting. But I know that
Okay.
there's also ways around that.
Okay, I'm going to dive into the Q&A. If you do want to put a question in there, you can do it anonymously, which is the first one we're going to come up to now is from anonymous. So, Katie, I'd love to hear Katie's views on how WAS compares to a solid retainer with an agency, where the monthly costs are fixed and their
Yeah.
support for various updates, consultancy, etc., are factored in. So, how do you
Yeah.
feel about that?
No, I think that that's a legitimate comment. It's saying, you know, perhaps in the way I've talked about custom there, it suggests that the ongoing model is like a bit of a nightmare because it's all unknown and it's all, but actually, if you have an agency that has a really clear, focused approach to that, and you feel confident and you've spoken to, always get references, always speak to clients, and and if you feel that that support model, if you can see that that model is working out in the market, then I think that that is fine. And there is, there are circumstances where clients want to work with a more custom solution, and so that support, as long as the support isn't then going to be a horror show. The other thing I should say about support, which does speak to that question and comes back to pitches and questions and all the rest of it, is checking in on support response times and so on. It's one of those things that actually rarely gets asked in a way, or it kind of gets asked as part, you have to like, just respond to it as part of a pitch. But like truthfully, how long does it, for an agency that's working on that custom model, like how long does it take for you to reply to, for you to fix stuff, for you to action things that we want doing? Because because if it's going to take 6 months to get something done, then in a way it doesn't matter that, you might as well be on a website as a service and just wait for it on the
Yeah.
roadmap.
Yeah. Okay, another couple coming in anonymous when I start saying the questions, you realize why people have asked for anonymous. We have a new CEO who does not want to go to any of the established providers
Uh-oh.
because she wants to reinvent the way we think about cultural websites. How do I manage upwards and convince her this is probably the wrong way of thinking?
Oh, I mean, yeah, that's a challenge, isn't it? I've come across this
What
in
would be
I've come
your
across
yeah?
this in like personal, like as in I've been in situations as an agency where the CEO is like, yeah, but we want to go with someone completely different, and the head of digital or the whatever they are is like, no, we need to go with someone who's got arts and culture experience. The thing about it is all you can do is just make the case with kind of facts and try and when it comes to the procurement process, try and get the agencies to be really to provide lots of examples of things they've done before. And in the pitch, it's like it's all well and good to talk in theoretical. We could do X, Y, Z. It's like, have you done that before? Can you show us an example of that? Um, but I would argue that unfortunately, it's probably the agency's job to convince the CEO of that because yeah, it's like any question about how do I convince my CEO to do X, Y, Z. Yeah, if they want to do something and they're the CEO, they will do it. But I think go with facts and data and examples and then just yeah, get the agencies to be really clear and show you examples of where they've not even the sort of show us an example of where you've um, integrated this thing, but what the solution, what the problem was that was solved, and how they went about solving that problem.
Okay,
Yeah.
you are now a digital agony aunt because I've got another one here, which is we are sorry we are I'm trying to shorten it. We're in the process of deciding whether to change ticketing system, but we also realise we need a new website. What would Katie's recommendation be for this chicken and egg conundrum we find ourselves in? Should we? I think that what they're saying is, should we choose the ticketing first and then go to your digital brief,
Yeah.
or is there a better way of, or is there having a website provider that then works out? Because obviously, I think a lot of the maybe behind this question, there's a lot of things that ticketing systems do that complement a website. From sign up forms or web
Yeah, yeah,
components or
yeah.
various things.
I mean, I
So
can answer that
what's
question.
your view on that?
Choose the CRM first.
Okay.
Maybe other people would say, oh, but you can. I just think it's so because really the website has to integrate with that thing. The only thing, I mean, like, unless you're going to go with something incredibly random, in which case you might want to speak to a few agencies and said, "Have you ever worked with this system?" We can I did have an experience of this about 12 months ago, where I was talking on and off to a really amazing organization, got quite a unusual setup for various reasons, and they were like, "We were thinking of using this particular CRM because of X, Y, Z," and it was like, "Oh wow, okay, that's kind of random." And so I think in that case, it's useful to just test the water. But if you're probably going to be going with, in the case of ticketing or whatever, a fairly standard system, then I would say just choose it and then go to the agencies, basically.
Okay,
But
last chance to get a question in for Katie. I've got another one I want to kind of come across, which is again from my ticketing background. If
mm,
I was a 250 seat theatre in Chipping Norton, Oxfordshire, or some kind of provincial town, I would say in my ticketing consultancy background, there's an obvious choice of these two or three ticketing systems that really are going to be the ones I think are going to be for you. Does the same thing exist through various levels of cultural organisations? When I say I'm a 450 seat theatre in Ipswich or somewhere else, and you go, well, actually, do you think you could say who you think will be the top one, two, or three are the people who are just suited to those ones better, without saying who they are, obviously? Are there ones that are much better suited, you think, or obvious choices?
yes, I would say. And I think your example um, is a good one because usually those sorts of theatres are they have very simple requirements compared to compared to other things that they could have. And so it's arguably easier, although doing a good job building a great website isn't easy in and of itself. But yes, I think there are agencies who work better with particular types of organizations. Even within arts and culture museums and heritage, there's like agencies that specialize more in museums and or more in visual arts, and then more in theatres. And then within theatres, to your point, yeah, we're just a small theatre. We just need something that works, and and then much more complex, multi-venue, multi-strand, multi-program organizations that need a lot more, a different type of approach. So yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. What this is the
Thought you were
last
going to ask
one.
me to name them then.
No, 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 I wouldn't do that because I can see people in the chat already. The last one that's just snuck in is very useful very useful that Katie went through the kind of costs and budgets or kind of ranges. My CEOs has asked about internal costs. So how can I estimate what the internal cost of change for the project is? Interesting one. And also, if you could answer that, Katie, and also maybe is there a different internal cost web WaaS versus custom?
By internal cost, I assume they mean time, like resource cost.
It sounds
Yeah.
like it from
Yeah,
this one,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Well, that's a good point because obviously in the UK and the North America, Bloomberg have been funding through the Digital Accelerator program, loads of websites rebuilds. And the reason I mention that is because as part of the project plan, that you have to specify, you have to say who's the person internally who's going to be leading this and how much of their time is going to be used, and is it realistic that they can do that? Do you need to backfill their role by, for like 6 months, whatever. Which is quite refreshing to see because it does remind organizations that, yeah, this is it again, it can be a lot of work internally. Um, I think if you're, in terms of how to estimate it, again, it sort of depends on what you're doing, how big the project is, whether it's WaaS or custom. And if it's custom, like how complicated is it? Who's going to need to be involved? An agency should be able to help you with that as well, though, in the sense of at what points will you need input from who, and then you can kind of estimate time based on that. I think for the project lead, you need to think about estimating, a certain chunk of hours per week on a project throughout the build cycle, basically. And you can just do it that way based on an hourly rate of time. I think it's more important that senior people realize that it's a big piece of work to get a new website built. Even if you're going with some website as a service, it's still, there's still a lot of extra, you're still doing that on top of your day job, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you
All
very
right.
much, Katie, for that. Very useful. We'll share some resources with people who were on this webinar. If you're watching it
Yes.
retrospectively on YouTube, please do get in touch. Thank you, Katie, for this doing this series. It's been very, very useful, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you. See you soon.